Hi, class. Today is going to be our next Applied Ethics Day, and we're going to be looking at two different articles on euthanasia, um, one from James Rachels and one from Philippa Foot. But before we get into that, let me just say two things. First of all, um, there's an interesting sense in which this really fits into the unit because remember, uh, well, Kant's not a consequentialist, and so we kind of have to look at things other than consequences. And that comes up a lot in the euthanasia discussion because uh, other than suffering, the consequences tend to be the same. Uh, but then there's also the fact that both Kant and Aristotle really put humanness at the center of things. And so when humans decide to end their own lives, is that something that should be respected or ignored by medical professions, etc.? And so um, that's why I decided to talk about it in this unit. Second thing, these two articles, besides just being the only ones in the text, are really nice because the Rachel's is kind of a short and sweet. It's written for a medical journal, and it just gives 5 brief lines of reasoning that are really things that we should be thinking about. And then the Foot offers a direct refutation of one in terms of rights, and her account of rights is something that's worth talking about a little more. So, with that preamble, this video shouldn't take too long, uh, but let's just start with the Rachels. He starts off by numbering his arguments, but he kind of stops doing that. So I think there's about 5 uh, distinct sets of reasons against euthanasia that Rachel's presents. And that's thing one. However, uh, some of them are really kind of only targeting the medical community. And so his article is best read in the context of this standard medical position, which is in medicine, letting die is deemed acceptable, happens all the time, but killing is not. And so it's important to realize that's the scope of Rachel's conclusion. He's trying to say, well, no, if letting die is considered acceptable, then so should killing in certain circumstances, of course. So, how's he going to argue that? I think the most persuasive one, the strongest one, is the one he starts out with at the beginning, which is um, the decision to let die in most cases, in these terminal cases, etc., is a decision to not prolong suffering. That if they keep doing their absolute best, the patient will suffer more. But notice that's a problem because if that is your justification, if the justification is to minimize suffering, to not prolong the agony, well, then even the process of letting die still entails a lot more pain and suffering than would be the case if simple injection or overdose, etc. Uh, considering patients starving to death over days instead of just getting an injection, and so again, the reason why this argument is so strong is it's a beating you at your own game thing. If your motivation for letting them die is we shouldn't prolong their agony, well, then if that is a morally acceptable reason to let die, that seems to be a morally acceptable reason for active euthanasia. By the way, he didn't define the terms, but I hope you know passive euthanasia is letting die. Active euthanasia is actually killing. So that's the first argument. The second argument is a specific criticism of how this distinction is played out in the medical community. Specifically, he uses the example of Down syndrome, but it's not the only one. So if you're familiar, Down syndrome has a very common intestinal problem that is fatal without operation. Not every Down syndrome baby has it, but those that do must be operated on right away or die. But parents can deny that operation. And of course, when that happens, going back to the previous argument, they basically, starve and freeze to death over a period of a few days or hours. Um, So in addition to the previous argument, though, he points out the problem here is the decision is being made on irrelevant grounds. Um, you're deciding life or death. You're deciding whether this life has value or it doesn't. Why? The surgery is easy, but it's somehow okay to perform that surgery, or not perform that surgery, I should say, if there's these severe birth defects. And so the decision of life and death isn't really about whether they have the intestinal blockage or not. It's about whether the value of a Down syndrome child. And again, he's not saying this surgery should or shouldn't happen. He's saying the decision is about the value of a Down syndrome baby. It's not about the intestinal blockage. That's a coincidence that is sometimes invoked. So uh, he's not criticizing that particular practice so much as criticizing how the decision is made. Um, and again, tie it to the bigger point about, well, is killing and letting die really different? In this case, they're deciding to let die. They're not deciding to kill. And so uh, if there's if it's okay to let die because they're Down syndrome, it doesn't seem obvious how that's different than killing. The third argument is the one that Philippa Foot directly addresses with her account of rights later. So pay attention to that. And the general conclusion of the argument is it's not obvious that killing is worse than letting die. Now, obviously, don't stereotype things. There are many situations in which killing is obviously worse, and there are many situations in which, just based on the circumstances. But his point is, even if we have identical circumstances, and he gives the Smith and Jones example, once the money intends to drown, does drown. Once the money intends to drown, lets die. He says those are still both horrific acts, and they don't seem, the intent to murder was in both of them, and it doesn't seem like one is somehow better than the other. And of course, the doctor's roles are not like that, but the general point of the thought experiment is to question whether, in these identical circumstances, is it really fair to say that killing is worse than letting die? And if you answer no, then what you've answered is, well, it's the circumstances that determine whether killing is worse than letting die, not the actual killing itself. And that's the important part of argument 3 that I wish you to emphasize a little more, is that, well, if these cases don't seem significantly different, that means killing is not significantly different than letting die. Instead, it's the circumstances that often surround killing that make it seem worse. Argument 4 is this kind of one that goes directly against a kind of argument that's used for why I think passive euthanasia is okay and active isn't, which is, well, active euthanasia is a termination of life. But he's saying, well, there's a very important sense in which the cessation of treatment in these kind of cases is a termination of life, and it seems like semantics to argue otherwise. And so, again, that's not a huge overarching argument, but it's directed towards this very general and common type of argument that for the position that active euthanasia is impermissible, whereas passive is. And then lastly is there's this important medical point that, well, passive euthanasia is okay because the doctor's not doing anything. They're not actively doing something. But says Rachel's rather rightly that there are cases where the doctor doing nothing is culpable and blameworthy. If they don't treat someone who wants to live, that's blameworthy. And so there's nothing inherent to the doing nothing that somehow gets the doctor off the hook, so that blocks that kind of reasoning as well. So there's kind of, these 3 positive arguments and then these 2 arguments that are just kind of directed at the a standard position that justifies it and doesn't and kind of refutes those standard positions rather than actually introducing a new argument. So that's the Rachels. Be aware of those. Again, it's a lot compacted into it. Medical journals are a little different than philosophy ones. But they're good arguments in the sense that they're really worth thinking about, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on the discussion board. We're going to move to Foote, who's a little more specific in certain ways. So Foote is going to argue directly against Rachel's and others and say that no, there is an important difference between killing and letting die. And it's really going to be a two-part difference, is what her account's going to try to emphasize here. First is, she says that killing means that an agent is what she calls an originator of a fatal sequence. That is, when things are left to their own devices, there wouldn't be a fatality, but then the agent takes some deliberate act that starts what's called a fatal sequence. And to draw that out, she uses the two rescue cases, which she leans pretty heavily on. So the first rescue case, you're driving to a beach to save 5 people. You hear a call about one person. Well, if you go to save that person, these 5 die. So you save those 5. That's, you let the one person die. Fine. Unfortunate, but nothing morally blameworthy. The second case, you're driving to rescue the 5, and in order to rescue the 5, you would have to run over this additional person who's in the road for whatever reason. That one is not okay, because there you are starting a fatal sequence. You are running them over. The other case, they were going to die, and you just didn't save them. This case, they wouldn't have died, except you are killing them. And so in both cases, one person dies to save 5, but we seem to think those are very, very, very different, morally speaking. Now, before we get too far into things here, it's important to note that that case in and of itself doesn't actually do anything to refute Rachel's, because Rachel's has already admitted that it's not the case that that killing and letting die are always the same. And so she's going to have to build in more, and of course she does. And she importantly introduces this distinction on 843 between rights of non-interference, which give us a negative duty, and rights of goods or services, which give us a positive duty. And so basically, we have those duties. The right to non-interference is just your duty is to not interfere. And rights of goods or services might be some other right. Or duty, I should say. And so those two can come into conflict, but they're also violated in different ways. So a positive duty, you're violated by not doing that duty. And so clearly in the back of your head, you should be thinking, well, a lot of the stuff that a doctor does is a right of good or service, and they have duties to do these things. Right of non-interference, your duty is to not interfere. So my neighbor has a right of non-interference, which means I have a duty to not do stuff to their property. And a violation occurs then when we do interfere, and of course that's a new sequence when we're interfering, right? When we're actively doing something, we are introducing a new sequence, and so remember the agent is one who does these specific things within sequences. So, what does this have to do with anything? Overall, go back to the rescue case. We have a negative duty to not kill people, right? So we violate that duty by interfering and actively killing them. However, to say that I have wronged the person I didn't save would be to say that they somehow had a positive duty to me, that in fact I owed it to them to save them, which doctors have that in certain senses, but the people driving the Jeep in the example certainly did not. And so that's how she pins down this important distinction between killing and letting die in those two cases. And so, in one case, I violated a negative duty of not involved in the right of non-interference. In the other, I simply I did not owe that person a positive duty. So she also says something similar has happened with the bathtub cases. Actually, she addresses Rachel specifically. She says, yes, both cases are reprehensible. Both are terrible. But not for the same reasons that Rachel thinks. Instead, uh, we have a duty to basically take care of children, and that is something that you might think of as a positive duty, and that was foregone in the second case, and that's terrible in that. And then, whereas in the first one we violated the duty of non-interference, or the right of non-interference. So two different rights got violated in those, and so they both seem bad, and they might even be equally bad. But they're not the same thing. They're two different types of duties being violated in those, according to Foote. Interestingly enough, just for some other stuff we've already talked about in this course, she says the problems like the trolley problem are unique because they are diverting a fatal sequence, and we've already kind of seen that argument, so I won't spend a ton of extra time on it. But then she also addresses the reason she originally wrote this article. It was in an abortion compilation. She thinks it applies to Judith Jarvis Thompson's violinist case. That, well, if I unhook the violinist, it's because I don't owe them a positive right. I'm not killing them. Because they're already involved in a fatal sequence. They're like the violinist is like the one person I choose not to save over there. By contrast, the fetus is not in a fatal sequence, and so because if left alone, would not die. And so she thinks that analogy. So she kind of misrepresents Jarvis Thompson's view by saying her entire argument fell on that analogy, because we read it and we know it didn't. But on the plus side, she doesn't take too much away from it. All she really concludes is that the violinist analogy doesn't work, and she doesn't even say, therefore abortion is impermissible. She just says, therefore we have to figure out the moral status of a fetus. So remember, Jarvis Thompson's argument was to try to set that aside. So anyway, that's Foote's article. Notice that it really only targets one of Rachel's arguments. So an interesting thing you might want to talk about in the discussion boards is, does it apply more generally? Does it apply to more of his arguments, or does it shore up the position of the doctor in this case and stuff? For instance, she doesn't say this explicitly, but one would think that doctors have different rights of goods and services. The doctor owes you a certain thing in a way that maybe it's a little different. So how does that account of rights work more generally? But overall, these are good introductory articles. They really are. They're made to get the mental juices flowing. So just use them as a springboard to start talking about these issues, as long as it's tactful and respectful, and argued instead of asserted. Great, go for it. I'd love to hear what you think. Otherwise, we will see you at the recitation.